Help me, ma'am. Please, I need something to eat.
Shut up, you homeless swine! Disgusting! Someone exterminate this rat!
What if the homeless man you ignored on the street was actually testing you? What if the beggar you stepped over was a billionaire in disguise? This powerful story follows Philip Tate, a self-made real estate mogul worth $3.2 billion, who decides to conduct the ultimate test of character. He dresses as a homeless man and sits outside his own charity gala. He thinks someone in his elite circle will show compassion. But what he doesn't know is that his wife Olivia, the woman he trusted with his fortune and his foundation, has a secret, one that will cost her everything. Stay until the end, because what begins with a cruel insult will end with a rewritten will and a marriage destroyed forever. Philip Tate sat on the cold concrete sidewalk, gripping a dented tin cup as he stared up at the massive marble entrance of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Manhattan. The crisp November air carried the scent of expensive perfume and exhaust fumes from idling luxury cars. Valets moved in choreographed precision, opening doors for guests draped in furs and designer gowns, their laughter and casual conversations filling the space around him. But Philip felt invisible. He was no stranger to this world. In fact, he'd built it. This was his charity gala, the annual Tate Foundation Gala, a $1,000 per plate event raising millions for homeless outreach programs. But tonight, Philip wasn't arriving in a tuxedo. He was testing something, testing everyone. He kept his head down as black Maybachs and Bentleys pulled up to the red carpet, now hoping someone, anyone, would see past the torn jacket and dirt-smudged face. A few guests turned their heads, glancing at the homeless man with brief curiosity, but they avoided his eyes and hurried past. The Metropolitan Museum wasn't particularly warm on nights like this. A palatial venue mostly filled with Manhattan's elite who had known each other through country clubs and charity circuits for decades. The foundation was Philip's legacy, the event was the social calendar's crown jewel, and the guest list had been curated months in advance. None of it mattered to Philip tonight. He had one goal: see if anyone would show him basic human kindness. Inside, the atrium buzzed with energy. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over marble floors. Waiters in white gloves carried champagne trays. Donors exchanged business cards and posed for society photographers. And somewhere in that glittering crowd was Olivia Tate, Philip's wife of 22 years, the elegant face of the foundation, the woman he trusted with everything. Philip adjusted the wool beanie covering his salt and pepper hair. The makeup artist he'd hired had done excellent work. Prosthetic wrinkles, dirt rubbed into every crease, 3 days of beard growth glued on convincingly. He looked 68, not 58. He looked defeated. He looked exactly like the version of himself from 35 years ago when he'd actually lived in his car. A black Mercedes pulled to the curb. The door opened, and Philip's heart stopped. Olivia stepped out in an emerald sequined gown worth more than most people's annual salary, diamonds glittering at her throat, the ones Philip bought her for their 20th anniversary. She walked toward the entrance, heels clicking on pavement. Philip extended his tin cup toward her with a trembling hand. What happened in the next 30 seconds would change everything. What Olivia said would cost her a $1 billion inheritance. And Philip Tate, billionaire, philanthropist, husband, would learn exactly who he'd been married to for 22 years. 3 weeks before the gala, Philip Tate stood in his penthouse kitchen watching Olivia arrange imported orchids in a crystal vase that cost more than a used car. Morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, 42 stories of wealth and comfort insulating them from the city's reality below. She was humming something classical, perfectly manicured hands adjusting each stem with the precision of someone who'd never done manual labor in her life. Philip sipped his coffee, Ethiopian single origin, $85 per pound, and felt the familiar warmth of gratitude. He'd built all of this, the penthouse, the foundation, the life where his wife could spend Tuesday mornings arranging flowers because she had nothing more pressing to do. He'd escaped sleeping in his car at 17, clawed his way through community college and construction sites, built a real estate empire from condemned buildings and determination, and he'd married a woman who made it all look effortless, beautiful, meaningful. Olivia glanced up, caught him watching, and smiled that perfect smile that had disarmed him 22 years ago at a charity auction. She'd been a nonprofit consultant then, and elegant and educated, everything Philip wasn't. She had the pedigree, the connections, the grace to navigate rooms full of old money, while Philip still felt like an imposter, despite the 9-figure net worth. "You're staring," she said lightly, returning to her flowers. "Just appreciating," Philip replied. "We've built something good here." "You've built it," Olivia corrected, her tone carrying something he couldn't quite name. Pride? Resentment? "I just make it presentable." It was a small thing, a throwaway comment, but Philip noticed she'd said you, not we. He noticed it wasn't the first time. The previous week, at dinner with the foundation board, Olivia had introduced a new initiative, luxury empathy experiences where wealthy donors could safely experience homelessness for 24 hours with full support staff and media coverage. Philip had questioned the optics. She'd dismissed him with a laugh. "Philip, darling, you understand real estate. I understand fundraising. Trust me." The board had sided with her. He'd let it go. Then there was the incident 2 months earlier when Philip suggested visiting one of their shelters unannounced, actually talking to the people they served. Olivia had looked at him like he'd suggested swimming in sewage. "Philip, that's what we pay program directors for. Your time is worth thousands per hour. Spending it in a shelter is inefficient." Efficient. That word again. Olivia ran the foundation like a business, measuring success in dollars raised rather than lives changed. Philip had built the thing to honor his younger self, the scared kid sleeping in a '92 Honda, eating from dumpsters, showering at truck stops. He'd wanted to make sure no one had to do that alone. But somehow, 15 years in, the foundation had become more about galas than groceries, more about donor recognition than actual help. And Olivia was at the center of it all, elegant and capable and increasingly dismissive of Philip's sentimental suggestions. He watched her finish arranging the orchids. She stepped back, admiring her work. "Perfect," she said to herself. Not to him, to herself. Philip set down his coffee cup, feeling something cold settle in his chest. When had his wife stopped looking at him and started looking past him? When had their partnership become his money and her image management? When had he become so comfortable that he'd stopped noticing? "I'm thinking of attending the gala differently this year," Philip said carefully. Olivia didn't turn around. "Differently how?" "Maybe skip the red carpet, come in quietly, actually observe how things run." Now she turned, her expression sharp. "Philip, you're the founder. You can't skip the red carpet. Donors expect to see you. It's about optics." "Maybe optics are the problem." Olivia's smile tightened. "You're being sentimental again. It's sweet, but impractical." She kissed his cheek as she passed, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and something else. Distance. Dismissal. The assumption that Philip's opinions about his own foundation were negotiable. He stood alone in the golden kitchen, surrounded by luxury he'd earned, and realized he had no idea who he'd been living with. The woman he'd married had valued compassion. This woman valued appearances. When had the switch happened? Or had he just been too grateful, too comfortable, too blind to see it? 3 weeks later, he'd test that question. 3 weeks later, he'd dress in rags and sit outside his own gala. And the woman arranging flowers in their golden cage would walk right past him without a second glance. Marcus Chen had been Philip's lawyer for 18 years, which meant he'd seen Philip do impulsive things before. But this was different. They sat in Marcus's corner office in Midtown, surrounded by mahogany and leather and the institutional hush of serious money being seriously managed. Philip had called the meeting cryptically, "Need to discuss estate planning. Urgently." Marcus had assumed health issues, cancer maybe, a diagnosis that made men reassess their legacies. Instead, Philip said he wanted to dress as a homeless man and test his wife. Marcus set down his fountain pen very carefully. "I'm going to need you to repeat that." Philip leaned forward, hands clasped like he was pitching a business deal rather than proposing to sabotage his own marriage. "I want to know if anyone in my circle actually gives a damn about people or just about proximity to my money, so I'm going to the gala dressed as homeless, see who stops, who helps, who shows basic human decency." "Philip, that's insane? Maybe. But I need to know before I finalize my will, before I lock in Olivia's inheritance and the foundation's structure. I need to know if the legacy I'm leaving is real or just expensive theater." Marcus had known Philip since the early days, back when Philip wore construction boots to contract signings and still checked price tags at restaurants. He'd watched Philip build an empire, marry Olivia, create the foundation. He'd also watched the subtle shifts, the way Olivia's signature appeared on more foundation documents, the way Philip's suggestions got overruled in board meetings, the way the foundation's administrative costs kept climbing while direct services plateaued. Marcus chose his words carefully. What specifically triggered this? Philip stared out the window at Manhattan's skyline. Last week, Olivia hired a PR firm. $50,000 to refresh the foundation's brand messaging. I asked her why we needed that instead of just funding more beds at the shelter. She said I didn't understand modern philanthropy, that optics matter, that donors give to organizations that look successful, not ones that look desperate. He turned back to Marcus. "I built this thing to help people like my 17-year-old self. Somewhere along the way, it became about helping Olivia's social calendar, and I let it happen because I was grateful, because a woman like her chose a man like me, because I thought love meant not questioning." Marcus had drafted enough prenups and estate plans to recognize a marriage in trouble. "Have you considered just talking to her? Direct conversation before you stage an elaborate social experiment?" "I've tried. She smiles and pats my hand and tells me I'm being sentimental. She's perfected this tone, affectionate condescension, like I'm a child who doesn't understand how the adult world works." Philip's jaw tightened. "I need to see who she is when she thinks no one's watching, when there's no benefit to performing compassion. And if she fails this test? Then I rewrite everything. The will, the foundation structure. Everything." Marcus pulled out a legal pad. After 18 years, he knew when Philip's mind was made up. "All right, let's talk logistics. You'll need ironclad documentation, photos, video if possible, witnesses, because if this goes where I think it's going, Olivia will contest everything. She'll claim mental incapacity, undue influence, temporary insanity. We need to prove you were completely lucid and methodical. I'll document everything. And the foundation? If Olivia's been mismanaging funds, you'll need forensic accounting. That takes time. I've already hired an auditor. Anonymous review of the last 5 years. Results come in next week." Marcus studied his oldest client. Philip looked tired. Older than 58. The kind of exhaustion that came from realizing your life might be built on illusions. "Philip, I have to ask. What if you're wrong? What if Olivia passes this test? What if she sees the homeless man and helps?" Philip smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then I'll know I married the woman I thought I married. Yeah, and I'll tear up the new will and spend the rest of my life grateful I was paranoid. And if you're right, then I'll know I've been sleeping next to a stranger for 22 years, and I'll make damn sure she doesn't profit from my blindness." Marcus began drafting. 2 versions of Philip's will. One for the woman Philip hoped Olivia was. one for the woman he feared she'd become. In 3 weeks, they'd know which document to file. In 3 weeks, sitting on cold concrete outside a glittering gala, Philip Tate would discover exactly what his marriage was worth, and Marcus would be standing by with paperwork that would ensure the answer mattered. The makeup artist's name was Rachel Kim, and she'd transformed actors into monsters, aliens, and burn victims for a dozen major films. But she'd never been asked to make a billionaire look homeless. Philip found her through a friend of a friend, someone who understood discretion mattered more than curiosity. She arrived at Philip's private office at 3 p.m. on the day of the gala, carrying 3 cases of supplies and asking no questions beyond the practical. How homeless? Recently displaced or years on the street? Philip had thought about this. Years. Someone people have stopped seeing. Someone invisible. Rachel nodded and got to work. She started with his hair, applying a special wax that made his salt and pepper look greasy, unwashed, matted in places. She added extensions. Thin, damaged strands that suggested malnutrition and neglect. Then came the beard. Not Philip's usual neat stubble, but a prosthetic piece she'd custom-made from real hair, patchy and unkempt, scraying in irregular patterns. She glued it on section by section, blending the edges so carefully that Philip couldn't tell where his skin ended and the fake growth began. "The thing about homelessness," Rachel said as she worked, "is it ages you. Stress, malnutrition, exposure, it adds decades. So we're taking you from 58 to late 60s, maybe 70. She applied prosthetics to deepen the lines around his eyes and mouth, added shadows under his cheekbones to suggest weight loss, created broken capillaries across his nose with red makeup to imply alcohol damage or frostbite, yellowed his teeth with a temporary stain, dirtied his fingernails with a brown paste that looked like years of grime ground in permanently. The clothes came next. Rachel had sourced them from actual donation bins, a torn peacoat with missing buttons, stained khaki pants 2 sizes too big held up with rope, a threadbare sweater with holes at the elbows, wool socks that didn't match, boots with separated soles. Everything smelled of mothballs and something sour Philip couldn't identify. Human desperation, maybe. The final touch was the dirt. Rachel had mixed actual street grime with makeup pigments to create something that looked authentic. She rubbed it into Philip's hands, under his nails, into the creases of his neck, applied it to his clothes in patterns that suggested sleeping on concrete, digging through trash, existing at ground level where the city's filth accumulated. "Don't shower tonight after," Rachel instructed. "The smell matters. People respond to smell before conscious thought. You need to trigger that visceral recoil." Philip nodded, watching himself disappear in the mirror. The billionaire's CEO was gone. In his place sat someone society had decided didn't matter, someone people would step over without seeing, someone invisible. Rachel packed her supplies. "I have to ask, why are you doing this?" Philip met his own eyes in the mirror, eyes that still looked like his despite everything else being transformed. "To see who I've been living with." She nodded, like that made perfect sense. Maybe in her world of creating illusions and revealing truths through artifice, it did. After she left, Philip sat alone in his office, staring at the stranger in the mirror. He practiced the posture, shoulders curved inward, protective, head down, the shuffle walk of someone whose feet hurt and whose spirit was broken. He picked up the tin cup Rachel had distressed to look decades old and practiced holding it out. Practiced making himself small. The hardest part wasn't the physical transformation, it was the mental one. Philip Tate commanded rooms, closed billion-dollar deals, made board members nervous with a glance. Now he needed to become someone who begged for spare change and expected nothing. He stood, testing the costume, and caught his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. The man looking back at him could have been sleeping in Central Park. Could have been one of the invisible people Philip's foundation claimed to serve. Could have been 17-year-old Philip, 35 years ago. before luck and work and determination changed everything. The gala started in 3 hours. Philip had 3 hours to become invisible, or 3 hours before his wife would walk past him on the street. 3 hours before he'd learn whether his marriage was real or just another expensive performance. He picked up the tin cup. Time to disappear. Philip arrived at the Metropolitan Museum at 6 p.m., 2 hours before the gala's official start, and positioned himself on the concrete curb 20 feet from the red carpet entrance. The security team setting up barriers glanced at him once, dismissed him as harmless, and returned to their work. He was already invisible. He'd sewn a recording device into the torn peacoat's lapel. Marcus's idea, insurance for what came next. Now, Philip sat, tin cup extended, and waited to see who his life had really been shared with. The first arrivals were early donors, the ones who wanted photos before the crowd thickened. Philip recognized Thomas Bradford, his business partner for 12 years. They'd closed hundreds of millions in deals together, played golf every month, spent Thanksgivings at each other's homes. Thomas walked past in a custom tuxedo, saw Philip, and his face contorted with disgust. He didn't just ignore him. He made a deliberate arc around Philip like avoiding contamination, pulling his wife wider on the sidewalk. Philip heard him mutter to her, "Security's getting lazy. Shouldn't let these people this close to the entrance." His wife laughed. "At least he's not aggressive. Remember that man in Boston who actually touched your sleeve?" They disappeared inside, discussing wine selections. Philip felt something cold settle in his chest. These were people who'd eaten at his table, 12 years of partnership, and Thomas couldn't spare $1 or a kind word for someone he thought was homeless. Next came Patricia Drummond, the foundation's board treasurer. Philip had appointed her personally, trusted her with financial oversight, considered her a friend. She emerged from a town car in a silver gown, diamonds at her throat. Philip extended his cup as she passed. She didn't break stride, but he heard her say to her husband, "The city really needs to clean up this block before events. It's unseemly." Her husband agreed. "At least we're inside for the next 4 hours. Let someone else deal with it." They vanished through the golden doors. Deal with it. Like Philip was a sanitation problem. More guests arrived. Jeffrey Chen, who'd invested in 3 of Philip's developments, Margaret Holloway, whose non-profit Philip had funded for a decade, and David and Susan Rothman, country club friends who'd vacationed with Philip and Olivia in the Hamptons. Every single one of them looked through Philip like he was furniture. Some stepped around him carefully, faces tight with discomfort. Others didn't even register his presence, so practiced were they at not seeing poverty. But it was Richard Cole who broke something fundamental in Philip. Richard was Philip's oldest friend, or so Philip had thought. They'd met 30 years ago, both scraping by, both determined to build something. Richard had been at Philip's wedding, was godfather to the daughter Philip and Olivia never had time to actually have. Richard arrived in a Bentley at 7:15 p.m. Philip watched him climb out, adjusting his bow tie, laughing at something his date said. Philip extended the cup, meeting Richard's eyes directly. For a moment, Philip thought Richard might recognize something, a flicker of familiarity, a pause. Instead, Richard's face hardened. He pulled out his phone and called someone. "Yeah, security? There's a vagrant harassing guests at the east entrance. You might want to handle it before someone important complains." He hung up and smiled at his date. "Sorry about that. These charity events always attract the wrong element. Ironic, isn't it?" They walked past. Philip sat frozen, the words echoing in his head. Wrong element. 30 years of friendship, and Richard had just called security on him without hesitation, without even a moment of human consideration. 2 security guards approached 10 minutes later. Philip recognized them. He'd hired the company, approved the budget. "Sir, you need to move along." "This is a private event." Philip kept his head down, voice rough. "Just asking for spare change, not hurting anyone." "You're making guests uncomfortable. There's a shelter 3 blocks south. Move along or we'll have to escort you." Philip shuffled away slowly, taking a position across the street where he could still observe. The recording device had captured everything, every cruel word, every dismissal, every moment of dehumanization from people who claimed to care about the homeless, who attended galas in their honor, who wrote tax-deductible checks and felt virtuous. Philip had spent 2 hours learning that his entire social circle was a performance. That compassion was something they practiced only when it was convenient, only when cameras were watching, only when the homeless stayed at a safe distance in shelters and statistics. Now he waited for the main event. Now he waited for Olivia. Olivia arrived at 7:45 p.m. in a black Mercedes S-Class, 45 minutes before her scheduled keynote speech. Philip watched from his position across the street as the driver opened her door, and she emerged like something from a magazine cover. Emerald sequined gown that caught every light, white fur, stole draped over her shoulders, the diamond necklace he'd given her for their 20th anniversary glittering at her throat. She looked perfect. Untouchable. Expensive. She paused on the red carpet for photographers, angling her face with practiced precision, smiling that charitable smile she'd perfected over 15 years of galas. The cameras loved her. Everyone loved her. Philip had loved her. She disappeared inside, and Philip felt a strange relief. Maybe she wouldn't come back out. Maybe he wouldn't have to face this final test. Maybe he could preserve some small illusion that his wife was different from the others. 10 minutes later, she emerged alone, phone pressed to her ear, stepping away from the entrance for privacy. She positioned herself near the curb, 20 feet from where Philip sat huddled against the museum's exterior wall, close enough for him to hear, close enough for the lapel mic to capture every word. "Darling, I can't talk long. Speech in 30 minutes. A pause. Then Olivia laughed. Not her public laugh, but something sharper, more genuine. "No, he has no idea. The audit, please. Philip doesn't even read the financial reports anymore. He just signs whatever Marcus puts in front of him and goes back to his sentimental nonsense about helping real people." Philip's blood ran cold. She was talking about him, talking about their foundation, talking to someone who clearly wasn't just a friend. "The foundation's administrative costs are whatever I say they are. Last quarter, I reclassified $30,000 in consulting fees that went straight to the house renovation. He never questioned it." Another pause. Laughter. "Because he trusts me, that's why. God, men are so easy when you stroke their ego and call them visionary. Philip built everything, sure, but he's too weak to actually protect it. That's where I come in." Philip's hands trembled. The tin cup shook, making a quiet, rattling sound. Olivia didn't even glance his direction. He was that invisible. "How much longer?" Olivia's voice dropped lower. "His father died at 62. Heart attack. Philip's 58, works 90-hour weeks, stress levels through the roof. Doctor told him last year his cholesterol was borderline dangerous. I'd give it maybe 10 more years? 15 if he's stubborn, but eventually that heart will give out. And when it does, everything becomes mine. The estate, the foundation, all of it." She paused, listening. "Of course I've been patient, 22 years of patient. But we're in the end game now, darling. A few more years of playing the devoted wife, the compassionate philanthropist, and then you and I can finally stop hiding. Philip's legacy will fund our actual life. The one where I'm not pretending to care about homeless people and you're not pretending to be just my attorney." Attorney? Philip's mind reeled. Who? Which lawyer had she been? "Bradley's drafting everything now. Once Philip's gone, there's a clause in the prenup that gives me 70% of everything if he dies while married. He signed it when he was desperate to lock me down. Young, flattered, grateful that someone from my background would choose him. Poor people never lose that scarcity mindset. They'll sign anything if you make them feel special." Her laugh was brittle, cruel. "The foundation's just the beginning. I've already positioned myself as the face of it. When Philip's gone, everyone will trust me to honor his legacy. They'll never know I've been bleeding it dry for years. Never know the dedicated philanthropist was just an investment in future wealth. Philip couldn't breathe, couldn't move. 22 years, their entire marriage, every moment of trust, every vulnerable conversation, every time he'd called her his partner, all of it was a con. A long game. A performance while she waited for him to die. Olivia checked her watch. I have to go. They'll wonder where I am. Tonight's important. 2 major donors considering 7-figure gifts. By the end of the evening, we'll be another million closer to our future. She paused. I love you too. Just a few more years. Be patient. She hung up, smoothed her dress, adjusted her diamonds, and transformed her face into that warm, compassionate smile that had fooled Philip for 2 decades. She walked back toward the entrance, stepping around a puddle, careful not to damage the expensive gown. She passed within 5 feet of Philip without even seeing him, her own husband. Invisible, less than invisible, irrelevant. An obstacle to be waited out, an inheritance to be harvested. Philip sat on the cold concrete, recording device capturing everything, and felt the foundations of his life crack apart. The woman he'd married didn't exist, had never existed. For 22 years, he'd been sharing his bed, his fortune, his legacy with a stranger wearing his wife's face, and she was counting the days until his heart failed so she could finally cash out. The tin cup fell from Philip's numb fingers, clattering on the sidewalk. Olivia didn't turn around. She disappeared through the golden doors, into the warmth and light and performance of compassion, leaving Philip alone in the cold, with the truth that would destroy them both. Philip entered the museum through the service entrance at 8:25 p.m., 5 minutes before Olivia's keynote speech. The back corridors were utilitarian, concrete and fluorescent lights, the hidden infrastructure that kept the glamour running. A janitor glanced at him, started to challenge the homeless man wandering restricted areas, then saw Philip's eyes and backed away. Something in Philip's expression made argument impossible. He'd texted Marcus from across the street, "Meet me, museum library, now, bring everything." Marcus was already there when Philip arrived, sitting at a mahogany table in the private research library that donors paid extra to access during events. He'd spread out documents, 2 complete sets of estate papers, foundation restructuring proposals, divorce filings. He looked up as Philip entered, still in full homeless disguise, and his professional composure cracked. "Jesus, Philip, I heard the recording. I'm so sorry." Philip said nothing. He pulled out a chair, the torn peacoat smelling of street grime and cold concrete, and sat across from his lawyer of 18 years. His hands were steady now. The shock had burned away, leaving something harder, something final. The new will. "Show me." Marcus slid the document across the table. 73 pages outlining the complete dismantling of everything Philip had built with Olivia. Philip read silently, Marcus watching, the distant sound of the gala's string quartet filtering through the walls. The terms were brutal and precise. Olivia would receive exactly $1, the legal minimum to prove she hadn't been forgotten, that Philip was of sound mind when he disinherited her. The prenup clause she'd mentioned, the one giving her 70% if he died while married, would be nullified by divorce papers filed simultaneously with the will. She'd get nothing, not the penthouse, not the foundation, not a single stock option or bank account or piece of art. Everything would be liquidated and restructured. The foundation would be dissolved entirely and rebuilt from scratch with new leadership, people who'd actually experienced homelessness, not people who performed caring from a distance. The estate would fund direct services, housing, healthcare, job training. No more galas, no more administrative bloat, no more Olivia. Philip picked up Marcus's fountain pen. Heavy, expensive, the kind used for signing documents that mattered. He turned to the signature page. The recording is admissible? It's a one-party consent state. You were part of the conversation, technically in public space. Yes, it's admissible, especially given the admission of financial fraud regarding foundation funds. And the divorce? Filed tonight, effective immediately. Prenup nullified on grounds of fraud and misrepresentation. She signed that document under false pretenses, claiming to be a partner when she was planning a con. How long until she's escorted out? The moment you sign, I make the calls. Her access to all accounts frozen. Her building key deactivated. Security briefed to remove her from the premises. By midnight, Olivia Tate will have nothing. Philip stared at the signature line. 22 years of marriage. 22 years of believing he'd found someone who saw past the money to the man who'd slept in his car and refused to forget where he came from. 22 years of loving a fiction. He thought of Olivia upstairs, preparing to give a speech about compassion and walking in others' shoes, while she'd spent the last hour discussing his death like a financial windfall. He thought of her calling him weak, waiting for his heart to fail, bleeding the foundation dry while homeless people she claimed to serve went without. He thought of 17-year-old Philip, terrified and alone. The boy who'd built an empire so he could help people like himself. That boy deserved better than this. Deserved better than a wife who saw him as an obstacle between her and a fortune. Philip signed his name. The fountain pen was heavy and final, the ink permanent. Marcus gathered the documents immediately, pulling out his phone to make the first call. Philip stood, adjusting the torn peacoat. I'm going upstairs, to the gala. Philip, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She's about to give a speech about walking in other people's shoes, about seeing the humanity in the homeless. I want to be there when she realizes she just walked past her husband for the last time. Marcus nodded. Security will let you in? I'm still the founder, still the man who paid for all of this. They'll let me in. Philip walked to the library door, then stopped, turned back. Marcus, thank you, for 18 years, for tonight, for not telling me I was crazy. You're not crazy. You're heartbroken. There's a difference. Philip smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. In an hour, I'll be divorced, alone, and starting over at 58. But I'll finally know who I was married to. That's worth something. He left Marcus filing paperwork and headed toward the grand staircase, toward the glittering atrium where 300 people were about to watch his wife perform compassion, while Philip stood in the shadows, wearing the costume of the people she'd spent 2 decades pretending to care about. The speech was about to get very interesting. Philip slipped into the grand atrium at 8:42 p.m., positioning himself behind one of the marble columns that ringed the space. 300 donors in tuxedos and gowns filled gilt chairs arranged theater-style, facing a stage draped in white and gold. The Tate Foundation logo glowed on screens flanking the podium. Philip's legacy, or what he thought was his legacy, reduced to branding. Olivia stood at the podium in her emerald gown, radiant under stage lights, speaking with the practiced warmth of someone who'd delivered this performance 100 times before. And that's why the work we do matters, because every person experiencing homelessness isn't a statistic. They're someone's child, someone's parent, someone who deserves to be seen. The audience applauded. Olivia smiled that perfect smile. Philip felt bile rise in his throat. She continued, building to her crescendo. Tonight's theme, walking in their shoes, challenges us to imagine what it's like, the cold, the hunger, the invisibility, the way society looks right through you like you don't exist. Philip started walking, slowly, deliberately, through the center aisle. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. The homeless man from outside was inside somehow. Security moved toward him from the perimeter. Olivia's eyes tracked the disturbance, irritation flashing across her face before she recovered her composure. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could just... Philip reached the stage steps. Security grabbed for him. He shrugged them off and spoke clearly, voice carrying, "Let him through." The room went silent. That voice, everyone knew that voice. Olivia's face drained of color as Philip climbed the stairs, still in his disguise. Torn peacoat, filthy clothes, prosthetic wrinkles, and dirt. He walked to the podium, stood beside his wife, looked out at 300 confused, uncomfortable faces. "Good evening," Philip said. "Some of you walked past me tonight. Some of you called security on me. Some of you called me a parasite." He paused. "My wife called me disgusting." Olivia stepped back, horror dawning. "Philip?" He reached up and peeled away the prosthetic beard, wiped the makeup dirt from his face with the peacoat sleeve. The room erupted in gasps. Cameras flashed, someone screamed. Olivia's hand flew to her mouth. "That's right, Philip Tate. The man who built this foundation. The man who sat outside for 2 hours tonight, homeless and invisible. But while you all stepped over him to attend a gala in his honor." His voice was cold, controlled. "I wanted to test something. I wanted to see if the people I'd surrounded myself with actually cared about homeless individuals or just liked the tax deduction and the photo opportunities. Well, I have my answer." He pulled out his phone, connected it to the sound system through the podium controls he'd installed years ago. "Olivia, you gave a beautiful speech about seeing people's humanity, about walking in their shoes, so let's share what you really think about the homeless." He pressed play. Olivia's recorded voice filled the atrium, crystal clear, damning. "Security? There's some vagrant trying to get in. Can you believe it? They think because we help them, they can just show up anywhere." Then her conversation from earlier, her voice dripping with contempt. "The foundation's administrative costs are whatever I say they are. Philip doesn't even read the financial reports anymore." Gasps, shocked whispers. Cameras now pointed at Olivia. She was shaking her head, reaching for the microphone. "That's out of context." Philip played the final clip. Her laugh, her cruelty, her calculation. "I'd give it maybe 10 more years before that heart gives out. And when it does, everything becomes mine." The room exploded. Donors stood. Reporters rushed the stage. Board members' faces went white. Olivia stood frozen, mouth opening and closing, no words coming. Philip faced the audience. "The Tate Foundation is dissolved, effective immediately. Every dollar will be redistributed to organizations that actually serve people instead of serving themselves. And Olivia Tate," he turned to his wife, "you're fired. From the foundation, from my life. Security will escort you from the building. Divorce papers were filed 20 minutes ago. You'll receive exactly what you deserve, $1 and a criminal investigation into embezzlement." 2 security guards, different ones Marcus had positioned, stepped onto the stage. Olivia looked at Philip with naked hatred. "You bastard! You self-righteous, sentimental bastard! You were always too weak to actually hold on to power." "No," Philip said quietly. "I was too trusting. But I'm done trusting performances. I'm done with people who see compassion as a costume. Get her out of here." They led Olivia away, her emerald gown trailing behind her, diamonds glittering under lights that now exposed rather than flattered. So she was screaming something about lawyers, about prenups, about this being illegal. Her voice faded down the corridor. Philip stood alone on the stage, still dressed as a homeless man, facing 300 people who'd just watched a marriage implode in real time. "Tonight was supposed to celebrate the foundation's work," he said quietly into the microphone. "Instead, it exposed the foundation's rot. I take responsibility for that. I built this organization, but I stopped watching it, stopped questioning it, trusted appearances over actions. That ends now. This foundation is done, but the work continues. Real work, with real accountability, and I'll be doing it myself, not from a penthouse, not from a podium, on the ground, where it matters." He walked off the stage through the stunned, silent crowd, still in his disguise, and out into the November night where the cold felt clean and honest and real. Behind him, the gala dissolved into chaos. Ahead of him Whatever came next. Philip Tate, divorced and disgraced, and finally free. 6 months after the gala, Philip stood in the kitchen of a homeless shelter in the Bronx, wearing jeans and a volunteer t-shirt, chopping onions for dinner service. His hands were calloused now, his nails short and practical. The Rolex was gone, sold months ago along with everything else that had defined the old life. The divorce had been brutal and public. Olivia fought every clause, hired expensive lawyers, gave tearful interviews claiming Philip had orchestrated a cruel ambush against a devoted wife. Then the forensic audit results went public. $8 million diverted over 5 years. Foundation funds reclassified as consulting fees and administrative costs that had actually paid for renovations, vacations, a secret apartment Olivia shared with Bradley Morrison, her attorney, and, as it turned out, her partner in more than just legal matters. The criminal charges came swift and certain: embezzlement, fraud, tax evasion. Olivia was currently out on bond, facing 7 to 12 years. Bradley had already taken a plea deal and was cooperating with prosecutors. The media had feasted on it for weeks. Society philanthropist exposed as fraud, homeless charity used as personal piggy bank, billionaire CEO's spectacular public divorce. Philip had ignored all of it. He'd sold the penthouse, liquidated assets, kept exactly enough to live modestly, and gave away the rest. $3.2 billion redistributed to organizations that actually worked. Housing first initiatives that didn't require sobriety or employment as conditions. Direct cash transfer programs that trusted people to know what they needed. Formerly homeless individuals trained as social workers and case managers. The new foundation, he'd kept the Tate name but rebuilt everything else, was run entirely by people who'd experienced homelessness. They made decisions. They allocated funds. They understood the difference between help and performance. No board seats for sale, no galas, no red carpets. Just work. Philip volunteered 3 days a week now. Not for photos or press releases. Not to feel good about himself. Because the work mattered, and he finally understood that proximity was the point. You couldn't help people from a penthouse 42 stories up. You had to show up. "Hey, Phil, you gonna finish those onions or marry them?" Philip looked up. Marcus Johnson stood at the next prep station, grinning, a former Marine who'd been homeless for 3 years after his discharge. PTSD, bad paperwork, bureaucracy that didn't care. The shelter had helped him get stable. Now he volunteered too, paying it forward. "Sorry, got distracted," Philip said, scraping onions into the industrial pot. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from shared purpose without pretense. Marcus didn't know Philip had once been worth billions. Didn't know about the gala or Olivia or any of it. Just knew Phil was a decent guy who showed up on time and didn't mind the grunt work. "You catch the game Sunday?" Marcus asked. "Nah, Giants actually won for once." "Watch the highlights. That fourth quarter was insane." They talked football while finishing prep. Other volunteers filtered in, a mix of formerly homeless individuals, college students, retirees, everyone equal, everyone useful, everyone seen. Dinner service started at 6 p.m. Philip served mashed potatoes, Marcus served green beans, and they joked with the people coming through the line. Genuine conversations, names remembered, humanity acknowledged. By 8 p.m., they'd served 200 people. Philip helped clean up, wiped down tables, took out trash. The executive director thanked everyone as they left. Philip grabbed his jacket and walked to the parking lot. His car was a 2015 Toyota Camry, used, reliable, anonymous. He'd bought it for $8,000 cash. It started every time and didn't announce anything about the driver. Perfect. He drove through the Bronx as evening settled in, then took the highway south toward his neighborhood. Past his old building, the luxury high-rise with the doorman, and the 42nd floor penthouse. Someone else lived there now. Philip didn't miss it. He took the exit toward Yonkers, pulling into a modest residential area. His house was a small 2-bedroom ranch, 2,000 square feet, built in the 70s. He'd paid cash, no mortgage, no show. Just a place to sleep and eat and exist. But he didn't go home yet. He drove 3 more miles, taking a familiar route, and pulled up outside the gates of what had been his estate. 22 acres in Westchester, the house where he'd lived with Olivia, the Golden Cage. It was a transitional housing facility now. So Philip had donated it 6 months ago. The entire property, fully funded operations for 10 years. 40 homeless families lived there at any given time, getting back on their feet, learning skills, rebuilding lives. Social workers on staff, childcare, job training, everything needed to actually help, not just temporarily shelter. Philip sat in his used Toyota, engine idling, looking at the lights in the windows. Families inside, kids doing homework, people being seen and supported and given real chances. This was what the foundation was supposed to be. This was what he'd built the wealth for, not galas and performances and tax deductions for people who wanted to feel charitable without actually changing anything. He thought about 17-year-old Philip, sleeping in his car, terrified and alone. That kid would be proud of this. That kid would understand that the point wasn't climbing so high you forgot where you came from. The point was climbing high enough to pull others up with you, not from a distance, not through checks and charity performances, actually pulling, actually helping, actually showing up. Philip put the car in drive and headed home. Tomorrow he'd be back at the shelter. Next week he was meeting with formerly homeless organizers about a new housing initiative. Next month, testifying at Olivia's trial about what happened when charity became performance art. But tonight, driving home to his modest house in his used car after serving dinner to 200 people who actually saw him as Phil the volunteer instead of Philip Tate the billionaire, he felt something he hadn't felt in the penthouse. Peace. The kind that came from living your values instead of funding a performance of them. The kind that came from being useful instead of important. The kind that came from finally understanding that wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or real estate empires or foundation galas. It was measured in how many people you helped when no one was watching, how many lives you touched without expecting recognition, how present you were in the world's pain instead of how much distance your money bought you from it. Philip Tate had spent 35 years building an empire. He'd spent 22 years in a marriage that was a con. He'd spent 15 years running a foundation that performed charity instead of practiced it. Now, at 58, divorced and disgraced and reduced to a fraction of his former wealth, he was finally doing the work that mattered. And the woman who'd called him weak, who'd waited for his heart to fail so she could inherit his fortune, would spend the next decade in prison learning that cruelty had consequences. While Philip served dinner 3 days a week and learned that the best revenge wasn't wealth or status or vindication, it was becoming the person you were supposed to be all along. He pulled into his driveway, shut off the engine, and went inside his small house where no one waited and nothing glittered and everything was finally, honestly, enough.